All right, I think we are live. Hello and welcome everybody to the April episode of ILV's Liberalism in Practice panel discussion. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Bush, co-founder of an organization called 1776 Forward, which is one of ILV's partner organizations, and we jointly co-host the bi-monthly podcast Free Speech Forward under ILV's Dissidents channel. So if you haven't found us there or listened in on any of those discussions, you can find us every 2 weeks, every Tuesday. In fact, I think we had one come out today. So check us there on any of the podcast panels. And for this month's panel, we're actually picking up on a theme that ILV recently has been exploring on the role of religion and faith in liberal society. For those of you who've been following along on their programming, last month they had the first panel that introduced this series, and they focused on the question, religion, do we need it? Which itself was a spinoff of a book club discussion Jennifer and some of the members of ILV started in the winter on Jonathan Rauch's new book, Cross Purposes, dealing with Christianity and democracy. So this whole topic of religion and faith and liberalism is one we all in the ILV network thought is worthy of further exploration, in part because we all come from different religious and faith-based backgrounds. So teasing out these questions and exploring them is as much for our benefit as for the audiences as well. So today's topic is on reason and faith. Are they compatible, and does it matter for a liberal society? Part of why I'm even here and introducing this topic is that I actually was prompted by me. We were having some offline conversations after the first one on religion, and I kind of observed that, that question deals more with proper institutions and social practices, but that there's a deeper kind of underlying question philosophically about views on reality and knowledge, among other things, that kind of underpin your responses to politics and religious questions. So Jen and I thought this might be a good topic to explore and kind of go there where many religious discussions often don't on faith and reason. They're often posed as opposites, but we want to see if they can be reconciled in defense of liberal values and explore other moral questions and how liberal societies can deal with the challenge of respecting plural worldviews without sacrificing rational discourse. So to help me have this conversation, I'm joined by some other new faces to the Liberalism in Practice panel series. We have James Petts. Hi, James.
Good evening.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
James is an advisor to ILV and a barrister in the UK. That's a trial attorney. For those of you, presumably mostly American audience, that might not know. I know I sure didn't. We have Joya Huenica. Hey, Joya.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Great to have you. Joy is an excellence coach, luxury travel advisor, and author of the new book, The Luxury Entrepreneur, as well as my co-founder with me on 1776 Forward. And we have Will Rauch. Hi, Will.
Hi. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Us too. Will's an educator, mentor, and creator of the Paradox educational platform, as well as the Cylinder radio podcast, both of which are designed to encourage critical thinking and civil discourse in high school education forums. So we've got a diverse set of panelists. We'll dive in. I've come up with some questions that hopefully will help us guide through this topic and get to the heart of the reason and faith compatibility question. For our audience out there, as a reminder, if you are following along on the YouTube or X platform live, you can just put in a comment or a question if you have any. That this is a panel, that's the point of it. So hopefully we'll have time to get to those at the end. Just put it in the comments there and it'll come through and we'll touch on that. So panelists, the first question, I thought we would just start by letting each of you define the problem in your own terms and even define your terms. I'm a big definitions guy, so I like to start off with those. And so my first question was, what does reason mean to you and in your life? And how does it interact with or complement your religious, personal religious or faith-based views? James, maybe would you mind starting off?
Certainly, yes. Well, first of all, I mean, I think strictly for everyone, you can't really do anything without reason, because that's fundamental to most kinds of thought. You can't decide whether to get up in the morning or what to have for breakfast, right? Reason is fundamental to all kind of cognitive processes in people. And I have a particular interest in reason. I am the person in the Institute for Liberal Values who does the Critical Thinking Shorts video series and the Liberal Concept Explainer video series. And I have a particular interest in maximizing the extent to which people understand what reason entails. Because I think that there's an awful lot of people who are not being rigorous enough with reason. Sometimes to their own detriment, but sometimes there are people who are trying to get away with getting people to believe things that they know there is no reason to believe is true, with the intention of harming others for their own benefit. And that's one of that kind of thing underlies an awful lot of political intellectual abuses, including but not limited to the critical social justice movement, which is a paradigm example of that kind of abuse. And so the view that I take is one should be rigorous about everything, and anyone who tries to undermine rigor about anything needs to be treated with some level of suspicion. In terms of faith, we'll come on to, I think, in perhaps one of your next questions, how that relates to religious practice. I don't have a religious belief, and I don't think that properly considered the evidence supports any particular set of religious tenets. So there isn't a particular thing to reconcile in my case, but perhaps different panelists may have different answers to that question.
That makes total sense, and I can see why. Maybe we'll go to Will and see what your view on that is, and perhaps you have a different perspective.
Well, what's interesting is I actually agree with James that I don't think there's a conflict, because I think that religious faith and reason and logic can go hand in hand extremely well. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to support that, whether it's from the number of Nobel Prize winners who have religious faith, or people in the public spectrum now, like public speaker like John Lennox at Oxford, or William Newsom, the head of neuroscience at Stanford. I mean, Francis Collins. These are evangelical Christians who have made their living and their career being logical scientists and people like that. So I think that rigor is extremely important. I think that religious faith can be done on a very surface level, or it can be done very rigorously. I mean, these are texts that people have been wrestling with and trying to discuss in great detail for millennia. So I actually don't see the conflict either. And I think that it's more about blending the two kind of ideas and taking a more rigorous view on, and a more in-depth view on religious faith. So I think that's really important. And I'm also with you on the importance of reason. I think that it's extremely important. But I also think that there's a lot of animating things as a human in humanity that is not very reasonable. When we talk about things like love, it's not very reasonable. You can't weigh and measure that the same way, but it's extremely animating. You do things that are unreasonable when you're in love all the time, and yet it's extremely big part of the human experience. So I think that there's a lot of nuance and complexity, and that's why I love these kinds of conversations. I think we can kind of pull that apart in good faith conversation.
Got it. No, that's helpful. And so are you saying that there's kind of a subsection of human experiences or phenomenon that are kind of outside of the realm of reason? Is that maybe how you see the two, and perhaps even navigate in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you are just a materialist, atheist, I think that it's ignoring the human experience. There's a lot of things that we don't operate in society as if we're just materialists. So when I say believe, a lot of belief is like, do you live it out? You can say you believe in helping homeless people, but if you're not down in Skid Row feeding people, then what does that even mean? So I think it's how do you live things out? And I don't think we actually live in a way where it's just materialist. I think that we actually live in a way that's not. So we have to reconcile, what does it mean to actually believe in something? If you're living out a certain way, then by definition, my definition, I would say that because you said definitions are important, I would say that you inherently believe it.
Okay. Well, now I'll turn to Joy on this question. Since I know you, given our partnership, I'd be curious to hear your response to some of what's been put down, as well as your own view on reason.
Well, then it's not going to surprise you that I am going to respectfully both disagree and I think sort of agree with both Will and James. On the one hand, I do think there is a kind of fundamental conflict between reason and faith. That said, I do believe, and this is going to be a huge part of the argument that I want to put forward, that what we absolutely need is a kind of blending between reason and spirituality. And I know you, so I know you like a lot of definitions out on the table. So let me just just put forward some of mine really quickly. Let me start with faith by saying that faith is a word that I don't use in my vocabulary precisely because I find it unhelpful. I find that it combines concepts that I could find useful. Faith can mean things like trust or confidence, but it can also mean things like belief in supernatural phenomenon against and purportedly very much against reason. And so for that reason, I just don't even use the word faith. Reason is a concept that is very dear to my heart. The framework that I have for reason, I think about it in three parts. You might think of it as the grounding of reason, the medium of reason, and the method of reason. The grounding of reason is all about observation and evidence ultimately from the senses. The medium of reason I see to be abstractions or concepts, essentially words or mathematical symbols are the medium of reason. And then the method of reason is essentially argumentation through logic. So even as a quick shorthand, you might think of the scientific method, the Socratic method. I think these are what we mean when we're talking about reason. Now, all that said, I also don't think that reason is the be all end all. I also think that as human beings, we have emotional experiences, intuitive, aesthetic sensibilities, and ultimately what we need is to combine all of these and make them harmonious with our reason. And so, what I really want to argue for is what I consider a first principles approach to spirituality, recognizing that humans are both social beings and individuals. And so, I think we need that first principles approach even to our own individualized spiritual journeys. And then we also need to think about building communities that support us in that spirituality and to do so in a first principles way. I know I'm short on time, so I'll go on and explain a lot more of that in the beginning, but I'll just share because everyone was also kind of explaining some of their background on this. So just so everyone knows, I started out my life as a Christian, as a Catholic. I always say that I took Catholicism very seriously, and that's precisely why I became now an agnostic atheist, not a materialist, because as you can see, I'm very adamant about the importance of spirituality in the human experience, but an agnostic atheist. So that'll be where I'll be speaking from today.
Interesting. That's somewhat of a new term that I think I've heard, but I think I follow what you mean. You actually kind of set up perfectly for us moving into the next question, which is let's just go to the heart of the matter, which is do you think reason and faith are compatible or reconcilable? If so, how? And because we've now gotten some definitions of both that I think get to why they're often seen as opposites. But if you don't think they're compatible, does it even matter for the purposes of building a free society? So maybe, Will, would you maybe start off with this one? I'd be curious, even kind of branching off from where you left off, of kind of how you then, especially since you see kind of these two different domains, how you reconcile the two.
Yeah, I mean, I as I said before, like I don't see any conflict. None of it like my idea. Can you hear me? Yeah, they're my ideas that I've accumulated over a long period of time. You know, taking in the works of different people. You know, different. You know, on the atheist side, on the faith side. You know, apologetics and whatnot. I think that the way to reconcile it is exactly what we're doing here. I think it's through conversations. I think that what brought me to, I came to faith very late in life, and it was through a whole process of wrestling with these ideas and having conversations and watching debates and kind of working it out in real time and with an open mind. And you know, a big part of reason is taking in all the information and wrestling with it and fighting with it and not having a closed mind. And I think that if you can do that, if you come into every conversation like this, like, I'm here to learn something, like, what can I learn from this? I think it's the way forward for all of us. And I think that because we have different life experiences, we have different brain chemistry, we have all these different things that are going to be variables in the diversity among human beings, that by engaging respectfully with an open mind, I think that you're going to naturally update your software and get new perspectives, and that's gonna change kind of the nuance of it. There's a lot of people in the Christian community that are very, very closed-minded, and I think there's a lot of people in the atheist community that are very, very closed-minded, and they're just certain that they're right. And I think that there's a certainty trap, and I think being certain is such a poison to learning and gaining knowledge. And I think that the way forward and the way to reconcile it is to be less certain, to have more intellectual humility. And that's something that I promote a lot. And I think that you just go to where the best ideas are, regardless of how popular they are, or how much they might disrupt your community, your social groupings and things like that. But it's not natural. We're built to stay in the tribe. We're not built to challenge that. And I do think that that's how we get to the best place, is to challenge the thinking.
That's a great insight. And I'm actually fascinated by your story. I didn't realize you kind of came to faith later in life. So I'm curious, with that perspective, most people like Joya, myself too, like I was born into religion, and that was just kind of the kind of accepted status quo. How is it different, would you say, from your experience? Like, how do you see faith and what role it plays in your life, and kind of vis-a-vis this kind of aim for intellectual humility and kind of still rational kind of basis?
Yeah, I mean, well, I would ask both. I mean, I'm friends with a lot of Catholics, and I love my Catholic friends, but there is something in Catholicism that is a lot of obedience, and it is don't ask questions. I don't know how it was in the churches or the environments, the communities that you were raised in, but so I have a question. If Noah's Ark had 2 of every animal, why would those animals not become inbred and get all kinds of abnormalities? Don't ask that question. Don't ask that question. The same thing with the critical social justice movement, which I think probably we might be on the same board with, or same page with. The problem with that is you'll never see Ibram X. Kendi sit down and have a conversation with Coleman Hughes. So don't ask these questions. Certain questions are just off limits. You can't ask this. You can't bring up this statistic. And anytime that happens in a church, I think it's really, really dangerous. And I don't care if it's on my side or another side. I think that one of the reasons why people pull away from faith is because as a kid, they were asking these really important questions and they weren't getting answers. So it just becomes dogmatic. I mean, I think a lot of people, Peter Boghossian and Sam Harris and people like that, I think that their issue is with the dogmatism. So I think that I'm on board with, I am not going to bring my kids around a community where they're not allowed to ask questions. And I found faith through asking a lot of questions. And I think that's a really important difference. And in my belief system, I think that God gave us a mind. He gave us the ability to ask questions, the ability to understand his world better. I mean, Isaac Newton he wrote more about, religion and faith and God than he did about physics. I mean, I think that there's a motivation that comes from people who want to figure out the world and, why are we here, and those big existential questions, that you should be asking questions. And I think there's a real problem in the church, the same way there's a problem within the critical social justice movement of don't ask that question. These are off limits topics to talk about. That's where I think that we can kind of get on board with that. And it was that process that brought me to faith, because I just started asking. I love conspiracy theories. And I was trying to, go into all these conspiracy theories. I was like, all right, this is the big one, this big religion stuff. And I went into it with an open mind, but I was trying to essentially prove it wrong in a similar way to a C.S. Lewis type or someone like that.
Wow, that is certainly the opposite of how most people come to it. So I love that. Joya, since you already shared that you went the opposite path, you want to take this one?
Well, interestingly, I agree very much with Will that the essence of this really is about questioning. And then to me, I see questioning as part of our nature, is reasonable, rational beings. And so I ultimately had, as he pointed out, the opposite journey. But I would also agree that I do think everybody essentially does need to go on that journey. And the way that my journey proceeded was precisely through asking so many questions and then not being able to answer all the questions. And I'll share some of my heroes have been figures like Abraham Maslow or Joseph Campbell. Campbell, who famously was a scholar of mythologies and religion and came up with the idea of the hero's journey, which was his way of examining almost all of the world's major religions and mythologies and looking for the common patterns that unite us in our common humanity. Those are the kinds of questions and quests that absolutely inspire me. And it's brought me to a point where I describe myself as an agnostic atheist. Agnosticism means that it's a question about knowledge. So if you ask me, what happened before the Big Bang, I don't know. Maybe at some point we'll understand more about that, and we'll attribute it to some combination of energy and matter and something else we don't even understand that, and we'll want to call it God. But at this point, I would say I don't know. But if you're going to say in terms of all of the gods that have been presented to us, Poseidon, Thor, Yahweh, I do not believe in any of those gods. I do believe that there have been gems of wisdom from almost all of the major world religions and many of the faith and belief systems that we now even denigrate as mythology. I would say we sometimes don't give enough credit to the wisdom that was contained in those belief systems. But I would say that where I think they all do fall short is that they aren't ultimately, you could say, upgraded with everything that we have learned humanity-wise in terms of what we now know about the scientific method, for example. And this is why I do argue for what we need is a first principles spirituality, recognizing that there is a whole domain of existence, the experience of wonder and awe, emotional experiences of reverence and exaltation and the sacred, that to me are perhaps the most important aspects of the human experience, that we need to save and revere all of this phenomenon, that we do need deeper meaning and mission in life, that we need what Maslow called the being values that we should all aspire to, things like truth and goodness and beauty and justice, and that we should have principles and live virtuously. These are all things that have fallen under the domain of religion and faith in the supernatural, but that I think we ultimately need to extract from that and ultimately integrate harmoniously with reason.
Got it. So it sounds like for you, reason is the way to reconcile many of the phenomenon that have been kind of closed off under the kind of category of religion.
Well, I would say from the reason standpoint of starting with observation, one of the things that we can observe is that what unites us as a species is this capacity to reason. And I'm going to argue coming up that it is precisely that common aspect of our nature, our reason, that is foundational to liberalism. So I'm going to argue that we can't have liberalism without reason. We can have liberalism with faith. It's a possibility, but we cannot have it without reason. And I would say that from reason, we know that this is a crucial aspect of what it means to be human.
Okay. James, you want to take this one? I'm really curious now to hear how you might square the circle.
Yes. Well, reason and faith, are they compatible? I mean, the word, as Joy pointed out earlier, the word faith is used in different ways. I think strictly the meaning of the word faith is just to have confidence in something, right? So I can have faith in the weather forecast, or not, if, as the case may be, if it's the long-term forecast. But I think sometimes people use faith to mean what's sometimes described as fideism, which is belief in something, knowing that one doesn't have a good reason to believe it, knowing that one doesn't have a sound reason to believe it. That isn't really what the word faith means. That is what some people use the word to mean. I don't think that doing something that one knows one has no reason to do is compatible with being rational, right? That doesn't really make any sense. So fideism is not compatible with being rational.
Sorry, just fideism, did you say?
Fideism, F-I-D-E-I-S-M.
Oh, fideism. Okay, sorry, just wanted to clarify. I haven't heard that one.
Yes, no, it is doing, as I said earlier, deliberately believing something that one knows one has no sufficient reason to believe.
Okay.
So that's a problem if.
So you're putting that as kind of different from faith in the way.
Yes, faith just means having confidence in something, right? And you can have confidence in something because there's a reason for it.
Okay.
In fact, that would be, if one's being rational, one would not have confidence in anything unless one had reason to do it, to believe it to be true, right? So faith in its true meaning and reason are very much compatible. Fideism is irredeemably incompatible with reason, or at least irredeemably incompatible with consistently applying reason to achieve one's goals. And let's look at the relationship between reason and goals. I think a couple of people said earlier that obviously reason isn't the be all and end all, and by definition, reason isn't the be all and end all, right? Because you can't have reason unless it has a goal. In other words, reason is use of logic in pursuit of a goal, use of critical faculty in pursuit of a goal. You can't choose by reason or for any other reason what goal to have, at least what terminal goal to have. This is a fundamental. Have a look at our video on reason in order to understand our critical thinking short, I think, on reason, just to unpick that. You can't choose your goal, right? The goal of a human mind is to have a nice time, is to have pleasure, as the classical philosophers described it. You can't choose that goal, and therefore you can't reason about that goal. You can reason about your instrumental goals, what things are going to help you to achieve that, and a convergent instrumental goal, in other words, an instrumental goal that will help you to achieve a very, very wide range of other goals, is knowing what's true. Right? So the more that you are accurate in your beliefs about the world, the more rigorous you are about what you decide to believe, the more rational you are about what you decide to believe, the better you're likely to be at achieving all your other goals, whatever those other goals may be. So that is a reason to take a rigorous and rational approach to deciding what is and isn't true and acting on that. And one thing that can be a real problem and can be unethical is where people knowingly make a claim that something is true in circumstances where they know that there is no reason to believe that to be true, intending other people to believe it. And that's dishonest, right? If I'm saying X is true, I'm implicitly claiming I have a reason to believe X is true, and that I'm giving you a reason to believe that X is true. If you go around believing that there's a reason to believe X is true, and therefore believing X, and I know that there was never reason for you to believe X, I have deceived you, and that is unethical. And that can cause really, really serious harm. So it is quite proper to say, if you are going around being fidist, but concealing that, in other words, pretending that there's a reason for believing something, but actually knowing that there isn't a reason, or knowing that there isn't a sound reason, then that is unethical behavior, and it is quite proper to call that out and say that that's wrong. The same doesn't apply if you go around saying, I believe X, but I know that there's no reason to do that. That's fine. That's perfectly acceptable, because that's one of the fundamental freedoms that anyone has, to believe anything they like for any reason they like, or without any reason at all.
Right. So for you, it sounds like the reconciliation then is that faith, properly understood, is confidence in a belief, which reason gets you to that point. And so in a way, one could say they have faith in a conviction that they have rationally derived.
Yes. And confidence isn't binary either. I mean, you don't either have confidence or not, but the degrees of confidence, you can never really get to 100%, right? I could be a horse having a dream of what it's like to be human now. The world could be a radically different place to what any of us imagine. So you can never quite get to 100%. Everything is uncertain to a degree, but also things are not generally 100% uncertain either.
Sure. All right, well, so now that we've kind of defined our terms a bit, let's move maybe into more of the kind of question about how does this question of reason and faith interact with liberal society? And, my first thought on this one is the question of, can you have freedom with faith, especially given the history, of religion, often, as we said, kind of dictatorial or kind of dictating orthodoxy without question. It has not historically been associated with faith, and particularly in modern times where we've built secular societies, liberal societies, kind of one of the foundations is separation of church and state. Should faith-based perspectives or religious worldviews, do they have any role in public life or guiding policy in a free society where we've specifically designed it to kind of circumvent or kind of minimize its influence? Will, maybe you want to start off with that one?
Yeah, I mean, America, which was the first real foray into Enlightenment principles in running a country. Even though we do have the separation of church and state in our Constitution, essentially under freedom of religion, the state constitutions, the vast majority of state constitutions required some, the leaders in government to be evangelical Christians, except for maybe Maryland, which was Catholic, but there was this element of faith as a requirement in this, because I think our founding fathers knew that if we were going to have all of this freedom, we needed some sort of moral matrix, these guiding principles to steer you in that direction. So I don't think we can separate that. I'm in the education world, and how the education system was founded, based on the Prussian model and the Rockefellers and all that kind of stuff, to build obedient students and people that didn't question things. I think that at the very least you should go, all right, well, it was established this way, so that has to have some effect on the future. Like the Western society, if it started with this importance of bringing faith in, then it's been wildly successful in a lot of the ways that we can measure success of a society, then it has to have some sort of role there. But James, all the stuff you said about, like, you shouldn't push something if you don't believe it to be true, or it's not reasonable. If you're saying that you should believe something regardless of reason, I'm with you. I don't think that that's good at all. And again, in the education system, if I'm going to say, I used to get in a lot of trouble with my fellow teachers, because they would say, your students are always coming up to me and asking, like, why do I have to learn about covalent bonds? And why do I have to learn about, calculus? I'm like, look, that's your job. If you can't explain to a teenager why learning this is going to benefit you in some way, then you're not doing your job. Then why are you learning this? And teenagers know that. They're like, well, how is this going to benefit me? Do you actually believe that this will benefit me? And a lot of teachers are like, nah, I don't even know why I'm teaching this. Like, that's a problem. I'm with you. And I think that the same thing goes for faith. If you can't argue how adhering to this belief system is going to benefit you in some sort of way, I think that you're not doing your job. And I think there are a lot of quantifiable measures that show that living a life of faith is going to be better. You can look at divorce rates, you can look at, depression, anxiety rates, whatever it is. There's a lot of proof out there, or evidence out there, I should say, to show that if you live this life, that there are benefits to it. And of course, there's negatives to that stuff as well, which you guys might have experienced, growing up. There's a lot of dangerous stuff. But I think that that's more aligned with the dogmatism, and then it's the abuse of power. It's the individuals who take anything powerful, whether it's guns or money or religion. These things are extremely powerful, and power can be used for good and bad. So it's not that guns necessarily are bad. It's that guns in the wrong hands doing bad things are bad, but guns in the right hands doing good things are good. And I think that religion kind of falls in that category as well. That's the way I look at it. It's not like inherently it's that it's bad. It's just it can be used in nefarious ways, I suppose.
Okay, I follow that. Joya, you want to take this one?
Yeah, and thank you for letting me go next, because I want to respond here and say, at this point, in many ways, I absolutely agree with Will that I think freedom itself is not a fundamental, and it relies on deeper, I would consider it, philosophical foundations that we need. And I think the founders did recognize that you can't have a functioning free society without human beings that at a certain level recognized virtue. I think you need individuals who are principled and aiming toward virtue to have a functioning free society. I want to say this differently and say that I think a free society even works best when what you do have are what I would say human beings who are self-actualizing, in the way that Maslow recognized that self-actualization and self-transcendence are essentially two halves of the same coin. This idea that we all flourish best when everyone is doing their part to actualize their unique strengths and capabilities in a way that can contribute to the world as a whole. And that the more you have people doing that, this is where freedom really reaches its apex. So I would absolutely agree that that I don't think you can have a flourishing free society without some level of philosophy and virtue, and as we say, right, freedom requires responsibility. And a lot of people do get that from religion. And I would just argue, I think that there is a better way that people can get that. And that's why I'm arguing for what I've been calling a first principles approach to spirituality.
Got it. James?
Well, one of the most fundamental kinds of freedom is the freedom as to what to believe and to what to communicate about people. And it will not communicate to people, rather. And it's really not safe to allow any kind of coercive authority to do anything ever to suppress that, even if there are good grounds for believing that there are people who believe things that are not true. The thing that can be a problem is that beliefs that are not ones that are readily justifiable with reason, in other words, that people tend to hold despite not having a reason, rather than because they believe they have a reason, or despite knowing that they have no reason, rather than because they believe they have a reason. Which is not by any means confined to religion, right? The critical social justice movement is a paradigm example of that kind of belief.
Mm-hmm.
Those will tend to
modern secular religion.
Kind of. I mean, it's like a religion in that sense, but not in other senses. So I'm a little reluctant to use that as a more general metaphor, but
Fair.
It has that one thing in common with at least some elements of religion.
Sure.
But one of the things that one has in those kinds of situations are scrutiny suppression. So in other words, when people who try to get other people to believe things that they know they haven't got a good reason for believing are true, end up with coercive power of any kind, we will tend to get scrutiny suppression, which will suppress the questioning and rigorous inquiry that is necessary for a free society. So the really important thing is not to allow people to limit what people can believe, because that itself is the problem, but rather by taking away everyone's power ever to suppress scrutiny. And have a look, incidentally, at our videos in the Liberal Concept Explainer series on scrutiny suppression. We're a series of 3 which deal with it. The really important thing is that all beliefs should be subject to scrutiny, and that it's not safe for anyone ever to have the power to take away that ability to scrutinize, right? The whole reason we're having a discussion is we are knowingly subjecting our own claims to the scrutiny of the others in the conversation who have different views. And we're allowing, we're doing the scrutiny ourselves. We all recognize the importance of that scrutiny and the importance of having beliefs that withstand scrutiny and scrutinizing others' beliefs. And it's really important. A corollary of having a freedom to believe something is having a freedom to question others' beliefs and to challenge others' beliefs, and to do so really effectively if it happens that your belief, your ability to scrutinize is good and the other person's belief is questionable. It's really important to have what's called a marketplace of ideas, in which people have the safeguarded freedoms to posit ideas and to question and challenge others' ideas, because in that a free marketplace of ideas, where the only coercion is to coerce people into not coercing other people about what ideas they may have, and that's rigorously enforced, the likelihood is that even though lots of people do tend to believe irrational things, and lots of people do tend to have flaws in reasoning, that is the best environment for maximizing the extent to which people are believing the correct thing, and therefore are doing something which will be instrumental to their goals, will believing truth and therefore achieving a convergent instrumental goal. So I think that freedom is absolutely fundamental to any kind of thriving system, and is entirely, that there's no incompatibility with people having even fidus beliefs and freedom, as long as the freedom is rigorously maintained.
Got it. And then maybe said separately, then kind of fidism and how that might influence public policy. I guess it sounds like, if I'm interpreting correctly, you would say it almost doesn't matter what is the source of one's belief, as long as it is kind of kind of rationally rooted, and I guess any other basis for how you would reconcile that. Or I guess someone who has a fidus belief, how should they be impacting public policy, if at all?
Well, the problem is, right, it's not safe to allow someone the coercive power to say your belief is fidus and therefore you shouldn't be involved in policy. That's the point. So the right response to fidus beliefs is to have a marketplace of ideas, in which people have unlimited freedom to question and challenge those ideas, and people who try to suppress the question and challenging through coercive means, they are the people who are subject to coercion, nobody else.
I see. Got it. That's helpful. So the last question was kind of more geared towards, people without a faith-based background, or with a faith-based background. Now we'll kind of flip the tables, and the question of morality. So, and Will, I think you even touched on this a little bit, but, this is the question: can you have morality without God or faith? So yeah, that's the question. Because oftentimes people, especially in this debate on religion today, that is kind of the position many on the pro-religion side are arguing, is that if we want to have a virtuous society, like Joya mentioned, religion and kind of the faith worldview that underlies it is kind of the only way to do that. So maybe, Joya, you want to start off with this one. As someone who doesn't subscribe to a faith-based worldview, how would you answer that?
Sure, I want to say absolutely, you can, and in my opinion, it's the best way um, to to uh, to have a society that is fully flourishing and fully free. In my experience and opinion, that it's best when it is a way that comes from an approach that is harmonious ultimately with reason. And I will say again, just to get back to this idea of what the first principle spirituality is all about, is precisely to recognize that reason does not cover everything, that there's so much of the human experience that is unknown, unknowable, in a sense goes beyond reason, and we want to respect that. But what we ultimately want is to come up with a code of living that is based on our rational observations of how human beings flourish. And well, Chris, like what we do in 1776 Forward, our focus is on freedom in combination with flourishing and greatness. And we take a rational approach to asking questions and looking to what is the latest science and the integration of the ancient wisdom tell us is true for flourishing and greatness for individuals and for society. And there's a way to have that, and it absolutely should be one that is ultimately harmonious with reason in ways that, as I suggested before, so much of faith in the supernatural clashes with reason on principle. That's precisely what they say is don't question, don't ask, don't be rational. And that's what I would say we do not need.
So you're really arguing for a reason-based approach to ultimately identifying the values and virtues, i.e., the morality that kind of underlies a good life, and for which, I know often kind of the typical atheist or non-faith-based view, it kind of doesn't always have a good answer for this question of how to derive morality in the absence of, because this deity said so or this scripture said so.
Sadly, I think that's true, that a lot of people, so atheism is just rejection of a god. It doesn't give you it doesn't tell you what you're for. It doesn't give you a pro case for being for anything. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people who come from atheism by just rejecting religion end up just subsuming the moral code that they were given, if it was Judeo-Christian, if that was the background they were raised in, or the country they were raised in, or whatever moral code it was they were raised in, they kind of try to put that in without a god. Where I think what we really need to do, as I've been arguing here, is this first principles approach of really going to the fundamentals and asking from first principles, how is it that human individuals thrive and societies thrive? What can we glean from everything that we know from the latest science and the global, expanding traditions going as far back as we know in time, to answer this question and put together something. And maybe I'll share, if this is how we're closing out, that this is really something that you and I had tried to do with 1776 Forward. We've used our reason to put together a statement which we intend to be big tent. Like the idea is that we want to have enough principles that give the organization identity, but it's not so all-consuming that it doesn't allow for diversity of thought. And so the way that we've even constructed our statement, which I would invite and hope people would even check out after this, if they come to our website, you would see that we put forward a statement of what we believe philosophical liberalism is, but it's a statement that I think you could come under if you were an atheist, an agnostic, a Christian, a Buddhist, wherever you might be on a spiritual journey. And I do hope that you go on a spiritual journey, that you can come join us. And I would say, maybe even just to agree with Will finally, that the way I see it is that certainly a lot of people are on a spiritual journey, and many individuals do live lives in which they are trying to have both reason and faith. I would ultimately say, from my experience, that I find that these don't ultimately integrate. And even in my observation, that the people who are both rational and faith based ultimately end up compartmentalizing their reason from their faith in ways that I find are not as useful or helpful as it is if you actually try to integrate everything. But that said, part of as a rational being who looks at what is the nature of a human being, is to notice that as human beings we are not omniscient, we are not infallible. We in fact have to go on a journey to try to learn more about the world and about ourselves. I do believe we do all need to go on a spiritual journey, and I absolutely respect people going on that journey. how they are doing it. And, all I would ask is that, we come under an umbrella of liberalism where we put guardrails that say, okay, you can believe what you want, but you can't kill people, you can't rape people. We have these certain rights, like rights to life and property and liberty that you cannot violate. But within that structure, believe what you will. To me, that's one of the glories of liberalism, is that it allows for freedom of religion and religion expression, and for people to go on a religious journey of their own, and to combine in their own spiritual communities as they go on these journeys together within certain guardrails.
Right. Got it. Well said. So Will, I'll turn to you, and I'd love to hear, perhaps even based on your own spiritual journey, kind of how you thought of the problem of morality, both before you came to a faith-based worldview and religion, and kind of even afterwards, if there was even a difference.
Yeah, I mean, people are like, well, why did you, go on this journey? I think at the core, it sounds cliche, but I wanted to be a good person. So I'm like, how do I be a good person? Do I just follow my heart? Like, is that what it is? But, the world can be really deceiving. One of the things I ask my students in my history class is like, did Hitler, because it's like, if there's a hell, who's in hell? Everyone says Hitler. It's like the cliche answer. But like, did he know that really? If everywhere he's looking, people are crying and tears of joy and praise and everything like that, then wouldn't his paradigm be something that's obviously not aligned with the way that we see it? So like, we all try to be rational human beings, but we're also subject to whatever stimuli is in front of us, and I think that moral relativism has a lot of issues to it. When we take morals to be very subjective, that's again a problem with the critical social justice movement. So we have to, when you say thrive joy, like we have to get really good definitions of what does it mean to thrive. Like, we have to define what that is. What does a good society look like? And if I were to ask you, like, what country, if you could live in any country around the world, where would you want to live? It's probably going to be a nation that had at least a good run of Judeo-Christian belief in it. So there's a reason why these things are aligned, that America that had that area. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just interject to say that one of the top places that I would pick from all of history would be ancient Greece, where it was not Judeo-Christian at all. In fact, centuries before the Judeo-Christian belief.
But would you rather live back then, where you didn't have, like, a warm bath?
But I would say the warm bath came because they were following what they learned from Archimedes in a bathtub, and following the science that they got from ancient Greece, and not the Judeo-Christianity. I think the history of Europe would have been far better if they had continued along the line of ancient Greece and Rome without the interjection of Christianity. That would be a whole different topic, but the argument that I would want to make.
Yeah, no, yeah, it might be. But like today, with like the modern amenities and stuff
within
like
the current context, you're saying,
you're arguing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I just think that there's something to, like, the proof is in the way it plays out now, but we have to get definitions of what it means to thrive, because there's a logical way to argue for, like, some of the worst things in society, like the idea of whatever Nazism, again, to take that as like the extreme of you get rid of the weak and you hold up the strong, and that leads to a strong nation. Now, how they define weak and the racial purity stuff obviously is horrific, and so many things that they did is horrific. I'm not a Nazi apologist, but we have to look at it like there is more to the world than the logic side. And I do think that if you want to say you're a moral relativist, like there is no correct right or wrong, that's one thing. But if you want to say that there is a right or wrong, and the definition of sin, or whatever, haruta or whatever it is, like to miss the mark. So you miss the mark, then that would be considered like a sin, and you have like a bullseye to be aiming for morality. That to be constantly aiming for that morality, that means that there is a bullseye. There is a right way to do things, and there's a wrong way to do things. And I think that the further you get away from the right way to do things, at least you have like an aim back. So I think if you believe in morals and moral law, then there has to be a lawgiver. I kind of think about it in that way, that the same way that you don't create math, you discover math. And if there is a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, then there has to be some way that was kind of in the programming of our reality.
Okay. Yeah, I see that. James, I'd love to hear your
last comment is very interesting. In the programming of our reality, of course, that doesn't imply the programming of our reality requires any kind of supernatural deity or anything of that kind, or anything related to an established religion, right? It may be just like mathematics. I don't think that reason-based ethics requires either relativism or religion or anything like either of those two things. There is a video in our Liberal Concepts Explainer series specifically about reason-based ethics. I will put the link in our internal chat, and I will leave it to those who know how to do these things, perhaps Jennifer, who's watching in the background, to put that more widely. But do have a look. It's only, I think, about 7 minutes long when you finish watching this live stream, so you can see the detail of it. But the basic principles are, we start with, as we started a moment ago with, the concept of a goal. In other words, your goal as an optimizing algorithm, as a human mind, is to have as much happiness as you can throughout your lifetime. That's not the same as the goal of your genes that created you. You are a MESA optimizer. In other words, an optimizer at a lower level of abstraction than your genes. You are doing their job for them, but in so doing, you have your own goal, which may or may not align with your genes' goals. I have taken the decision that I'm happy in not having any children, which definitely doesn't align with my genes' goals, but does align with mine. So once you've got to the position that you are an optimizing algorithm, you have goals, and then your goals can, in some cases, conflict with other people's goals. That is where ethics comes from, fundamentally. What is the right way of resolving that conflict between your goals and other people's goals? And the right way of resolving that conflict is in the way which minimizes the harm caused by that conflict. So in other words, to take one example, I am better off in a world in which theft is prohibited than one in which theft is permitted. Because even though I lose the opportunity to steal things, you don't need to be a moral relativist. You don't need to believe anything supernatural to reach that conclusion. And I'm better off, even though I lose the opportunity to steal things, by cooperating in a system which reliably detects and severely punishes theft. Because everyone is better off in a world in which people's property rights are respected and which they're not, even if there are downsides to that in some cases. And that fundamental principle underlies all true ethics, right? If something isn't based on that principle, you don't get to ethics. Interestingly, I think people have pointed out that whatever their merits more generally, some of the ancient religious texts do contain pearls of wisdom. In fact, it would be surprising if they didn't, given that humans have been around for a very long time and these things had caught on. One of the ones in Christianity that does work is the principle of do unto others as you would be done unto by yourself, which is perhaps one of the most well-known moral tenets of Christianity. And that is very similar to this proposition. And you don't need to have the religious belief in the first place to get to that claim. You can get to that claim entirely without a religious belief or without relativism. One of the really interesting things I think that Will said a moment ago was, when asked what were the reasons that he went down the spiritual journey in the first place, was he wanted to be a good person. Well, that implies, of course, knowing what being a good person is quite independently of having alighted upon the religious belief, which in turn implies that it's possible to work out what's good and bad without having the religious belief in the first place. So that contradicts the claim, if that claim is being made, that you have to start with a religious premise in order to know what's good or bad, because otherwise someone else might say, well, I have a really strong belief in this other religion. I really feel that it's true that there's this other deity, and my life was much better after I started believing this thing. But all my moral beliefs are precisely the opposite of yours. And what would be the answer to that question? Well, the only answer to that question is, well, there is actually a way of deciding what is true and false about what is ethical that is quite independent of your religious belief.
Can I just jump in real quick? Oh, sorry. Go.
Just a couple of things to tie up one or two other things. I think Joy talked a couple of times about things that are unknown and unknowable. I don't think those are apart from reason. You can reason about things that are unknown and unknowable. You can say, I don't know that X is true, or whether X is true, and therefore I should take my decisions based on the fact that X may or may not be true. And the same goes for things that aren't knowable, right? So they're not apart from reason. You can definitely reason about things that are unknowable. We have a video in our critical thinking short series specifically about uncertainty and how to reason about uncertainty. And also I think people talk about things that are spiritual. I'm not sure that I recognize that as a particularly meaningful thing. It tends to be connected to religious or supernatural concepts. It's not entirely clear to me what that means. And I don't think one needs that concept to get to most of the conclusions we've reached. I think you can get to the conclusions about human flourishing without the concept of being spiritual. You can just look at what are realities, what are people's goals, what are the most effective ways of achieving those goals? What is true about the world? What can we discover? And what's the most effective way of doing that? The concept of spirituality doesn't need to intermediate in that in order to get from the data to an answer.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Yeah.
No, like,
so go for it.
Just real quick, like a couple of things. Like you said, like we could get there without it, like potentially, but I don't know if there's good examples of people who have gotten there without it. Like we did reconcile our understanding of morals. Even people who wouldn't be religious, like they had some influence. You're kind of like standing, whatever, like what term is, like standing on the shoulders of giants, like people who have established this over a long time with the background, because like logic and faith weren't separated until like more modern history. Like that was like the scholars were typically like religious scholars that were deciding a lot of this stuff. Not everywhere, not in every society, but a lot of it. But when you said, James, you said like math doesn't require like a designer or a supernatural. I'm curious where you think that gets it from, because I was influenced by the idea of C.S. Lewis, where he's like, you know, our understanding of the world now is like this cup has a designer, this building had an architect. Even if I don't know who the architect is, like things that are built had a builder. So if you say like where do you believe math came from if it wasn't designed? And I guess that because that's confusing for me, because I would go for the same thing for morals. For me, it's like when I wanted to decide to, you know, how do I be a good person? It's like, is there a possibility to be a good person? Like, can you do good? And then I didn't want to jump into the religious side of it, but like essentially it's like, well, this gives you an answer of like, this is how you're good. And the idea, just like an architect would design a building, an architect designed morality. So I'm curious, like where you believe like math came from.
Well, I mean, the question, where does math come from, right, contains an assumption which is inconsistent with the nature of mathematics itself. So in other words, coming from something requires you to understand all the basics of mathematics and logic. So nothing can come from anything without there being an idea of what it is to come from something, and that in turn requires an understanding of mathematics and logic, right? So the question itself isn't actually coherent when fully understood. Maths can't come from anything, because you can't have anything coming from anything without first having maths. So it's that you start with the fundamentals of maths and logic, and you start with data, and you work from there, because that is where everything comes. You get an idea of a designer. You have to have a goal, and that's a much more complex thing than numbers. And you always start with the simple and build up to the more complex on top of that, right? You can't start with a complex assumption, because a complex thing requires all the simple things that are its components of first. So you can't say, it's logically not possible to say, that you've got this complex thing that precedes the simple things that it's built of. That's just logically impossible.
So math just always existed. It just always was 1 + 1 = 2.
Well, always makes assumptions about time, right? So, yeah. I mean, so time is a complex thing in many ways. It is a dimension. Of course, a dimension is itself a mathematical complex. But certainly, it doesn't make any sense to think of mathematics as varying over time. Time is finite, just as all the dimensions are finite, because the universe is made of integers. Right? That's how the universe works. So obviously, something that is fundamental to reality and fundamental to what it means for there to be an always has always been there. That wouldn't make any sense for it to be otherwise.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, please.
I want to share a perspective of where math comes from, speaking from the fact that I have a toddler. You might even see him more at the playground and we're running around. And I can give you a very clear sense of at least where mathematics comes from in terms of someone's development, which is, so it started with, we had one piece of candy, and then we had two pieces of candy, and then we had three pieces of candy, right? And then from that, we're grasping, and then, we can learn that, okay, we have like one cookie, and we have two cookies, and now we have three cookies. And we're starting from these very concrete things to go to a more abstract system of numbers. And of course, you can see how, with reason, starting off with the evidence on what we get from the senses, how we start with the concrete and move up to something more and more abstract. Like, I would say that the way I think of math is that it's something that is discovered, and in Newton's words, it is giants standing on the shoulders of other giants to expand out the system. And when you get to the farther reaches, the math that I admittedly do not understand at all, there are so many arguments about, what really actually is even true and which of these methods are valid. And this is precisely where we even need reason to have these arguments. I want to answer one of Will's other questions too about like examples, and I just want to bring up my other two heroes to share two very different people who I consider heroic, who I think had answers, profound answers to these questions about morality in ways that transcend at least nominal ideas of faith and religion. The first being Abraham Maslow, who was, I think, even explicitly, decidedly an atheist, but he's famous for what's called now like the hierarchy of needs and drives. So the way that he looked across human experience to say that, human beings, we have physiological needs, we have safety needs, connection needs, love needs, esteem needs, and then ultimately at the top we have self-actualization and self-transcendence needs, and talked beautifully about the being values, truth, love, justice, that things that human beings aspire to. And he talked about the peak experiences and how important those are, and just really wonderful observations about self-actualizing human beings, who interestingly he saw just as the healthy human beings, that he saw that this was a capacity that we all can reach, even though so few do. And then just another completely different example, I mentioned Joseph Campbell, who I'm not exactly sure how he would have ultimately ended his life. He might have even ultimately said he was a person of faith, but his whole approach to religion was to see the beauty and the wisdom of the mythological stories in terms of their symbolism and the ways that they relate to our deep psychology and the ways that we develop over the course of a lifetime, the importance of rituals. So I guess if Will or anyone in the audience is asking for ways that we might think about some of these deep questions in different ways, these are two heroes of mine that I would definitely point to.
Well, thank you for that. We're coming up on time, which is great because we're at the last question anyways, which is, and I expected that deep dive on the morality question to kind of go in different directions. It is one of the most critical ones that I think a lot of people wrestle with, and that is at the root of why even I posed this question of faith versus reason. I think you all have provided some really great different perspectives on how that is answered. But let's bring it back to why we're all here as fellow liberals, philosophical liberals, aiming towards building a freer society, and tie this question back to it and the reconciliation question, which is, what role can reason and faith, or faith, kind of one or the other, both, none, play in building, defending, and advancing liberalism? And kind of as a follow-on to that is, how do you see liberalism as mediating between these differing worldviews? Because it sounds like there's probably more alignment among this group, perhaps, than misalignment. But obviously, we know, there's many people out there in the world who are, much farther, kind of apart on the spectrum of many of these questions. James, do you want to start off with this one?
Certainly. I think you're probably right that that in this room we are rather more aligned on this question than perhaps some of the other questions. As I think I said earlier, the more important thing, I think even more important than getting the belief about how the universe, or what the universe is made of, right, is allowing people the freedom to make that choice for themselves. Because in a world in which people are free to make that choice for themselves, although some people will make the wrong choices, the greater likelihood is that people will make the right choice than in a world in which people are oppressed. Not least because if what to believe is decided by whoever happens to have coercive power, rather than by the exercise of free choice, the question of what to believe will be determined by what's in the interest of people with coercive power, rather than what's in the interest of people making the choice. Knowing the truth is a convergent instrumental goal. So me knowing what is true and actually making a true belief is more valuable to me than believing something that is false. But having power is also a convergent instrumental goal. And suppressing other people's ability to know the truth is often something that helps to increase another person's power. So anyone having power over another to decide what that person may believe or what that person may try to communicate to others or persuade someone else to believe is never going to be safe. That person is liable to and likely to use that power to trade off an arbitrarily large amount of harm to someone else for an arbitrarily small benefit to themselves. And the more power they have, the more likely they are to do that. So the world in which people are free to believe whatever they like and to seek to persuade people whatever they like, and the only thing that people can't do is use coercion to back their beliefs, and the only thing that people are allowed to use coercion to do is to stop people from using coercion to back up their beliefs, is the world in which people are more likely to believe true things, even if people will inevitably, some people will believe things that are wrong. And we disagree in this room about what is right. And we are, I think, happily all in agreement that the right way of resolving that is not by saying you must not believe this, or you must not try to persuade other people of this, but rather to subject each other's views to rigorous critical scrutiny. And we may still not agree at the end, but it is still better that we have the freedom to do that and the freedom to advance our own views than we don't. And for any given person, right, it is true that my freedom to advance my views is more valuable to me than my ability or power to stop you from advancing yours. And that goes for everybody. The only people for whom that kind of power is more valuable is those who actually have that power, and for whom, which is a tiny minority of any given number of people, and for whom there's not a choice between freedom and power, because their power is their own freedom, and they simply don't care about other people. So it'll never be safe to use coercion to prevent someone from trying to persuade or trying to question, even if other people are believing things that are not true.
Joya?
I would just even build off of what James said and point out something that certainly is not original to me, that many other commentators have noticed, that, for example, religions like Islam have never had their enlightenment moment where they recognized the importance of, even if you're going to have faith, to combine faith with reason, to say that we're going to uphold rational argumentation as opposed to coercion. And that this is part of the argument that I didn't quite get to make here of why liberalism and a free society is, I think, ultimately based on a view of human beings as rational agents, as individuals who are coming together in a society who are not omniscient, who are not infallible, who are not omnipotent, but who need to discover truth, working together, communicating, and then ultimately collaborating together to build the world that we live in and live peacefully amongst each other. And that this, in a sense, is based on a recognition of the ways in which we are rational. And I think once we have that, one of the beauties of the liberal system is that if you at least can agree on these certain guardrails, the rights to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, respecting freedom of speech, that we can also then have freedom of religion and say you are free to go on your spiritual journeys, to express your religion, to come together in your communities, as long as you don't kill people, rape people, et cetera, et cetera. And it's one of the beauties of the liberal system is that we allow people to do that, and we get to learn, because I just maybe want to end by reiterating one of the points that I made that perhaps didn't make enough, which is that I do believe that there are gems of wisdom from all of the major religions, that if they've lasted for this long, that there's a reason for that, that people have been getting value from that. And we ought to be extracting the value that we can from everything. I love the vision of the American system as the melting pot, where we get to take the best from all the cultures. And I think that includes all the different cultural expressions of religion. So I love that we can have the big tent that, with these guardrails, invites people to pursue their different religions and learn from each other.
Well, that is certainly the liberal creed and ideal when fully realized, and certainly the one that was aimed for when America was founded, and the rest of the West too. So, Will, why don't you close us out on this one?
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on both of what Joy and James said, freedom of religion, to make your own choice, to deny him, is God gives you that power too. I mean, it's not a coercive. It's like you can choose to deny me or not. It's free will. Also, James, what you said about people in coercive power. I mean, Jesus, I'm like, I even bulk myself. I call myself a Christian. I'm thinking of myself more as like a Jesus follower, like a Jesus guy. And the people who triggered him the most were the Pharisees. They were the people in coercive power. They were the ones who were in power, using, God, using religion to manipulate people. I mean that's who pissed him off to the point where he is overturning tables and everything like that. So that's something to take note of. And I think that reconciling these two comes through, obviously, like what we're doing now with civil discourse. But I think there's also something to take note of, is as technology is more advanced, it seems to be aligning, from what I've seen, a lot with biblical truths. Whether it's like Stanford's report on the Y chromosome atom and mitochondrial Eve might have lived at the same time, or the Big Bang, or even like the Bethesda pools, archaeologists digs up, or even the Jesus story itself, like the reality that like Jesus of Nazareth was a real person who was killed by Roman crucifixion, that people were willing to be tortured and killed for the belief that they saw him rise from the dead. And I think just talking about logic and reason to close it out, I don't think it would be logical to say that people would willingly be tortured and killed for something they knew to be a lie. So at the very least, a lot of people believed this to the point where that they believed that they saw him, to the point where they were willing to die for that. And I think that that's just going to lead to this conversation debate going on for a long time, because I don't believe that there's going to be some sort of proof, evidence to come out to say like, oh, this is false, the Christian faith is false. But it's also going to be set up in a way where you always are going to have the choice to not believe it, because I think, again, that's by design, so that you have to have, for going back to what we started with, you have to have faith. Because if God just opens up the clouds and is like, yo, I'm real, then we become automatons and we don't really have that choice. And then I don't see it as something that's loving. If you're forced to believe something, you don't have the choice to not believe it, then I don't believe that's love. So that's kind of the way I would kind of reconcile all that stuff.
Yeah, and so for you, it sounds like there isn't necessarily a conflict, or that one side is more or less set up to kind of defend and advance liberal principles.
No, I think that we have to. No, I think that they work together. I think that liberal principles are going to give us the framework and give us the platform and the arena to have those kinds of conversations. And then I believe that in the marketplace of ideas, James talked about the marketplace of ideas. I couldn't agree more. I think in the marketplace of ideas, that living the way that Jesus called us to live is going to be the best way for human beings to live. Not necessarily how Christians behave, though, not necessarily how institutions behave, because people are
that obviously gets into the choice part of morality. Regardless of its morality's roots, people still have to choose to practice it, right? All right. Well, thank you all for an awesome discussion. That completes our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for being such a great host today.
Yeah.